That type of song is what we normally sing whenever we have a gathering to call the people in to basically get things started. And like I was explaining before, when two groups would meet, two tribes, there were these songs called Gwando Day songs. And Gwando Day is a greeting word that's only used in music. If I was to say hello to you in Abenaki or Micmac or Maliseet or Passamaquoddy, it would be the Kwe Kwe or Kwa Kwa or Kwe Kwe. They're all very similar. In our case, it's Kwe Kwe.
As we've been doing for a couple of years now, we start with an acknowledgement of those who came before us and those who are still here now. Here in Vermont, this land is the traditional and unceded or unsurrendered land of the Abenaki people, who have had a continual and enduring presence here in Endakana for thousands of years. That presence continues to this day, and we gratefully acknowledge the Abenaki stewardship of this land and the vital role of Indigenous people in maintaining democratic societies around the world.
Kwekwe Undelawazi, Vera Longtoe Sheehan, Elnu Wabanaki, Gitsi Willawini, to the Vermont Humanities Council for having us here today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm sitting in the ancestral unceded homelands of the Minisink people, who, like the Abenaki, have been unrecognized for so long, and in hopes of offering allyship to them toward their move toward future recognition. We'd like other people to be aware that there are many unrecognized tribes out there. So my name is Vera Longtoe Sheehan. I'm the director of the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association, the founder of the Abenaki Arts and Education Center, and a citizen of the Elnu Abenaki tribe. Tonight, we're going to have a panel discussion called Democracy, Social Change, and Representation in Undakana. Undakana is the Abenaki word for homeland. And I'm sitting here with four very close friends who are going to help me out tonight. Could you each take a moment and introduce yourselves in the way that you would like to be known?
Kwai Kwai, Indilawazi Sally Gould, Indai Manadnock, in Wikiak Massasecum, Abazno Dakad. So I said, hello, my name is Sherry Gould, and I was born at Monadnock. We use the local place name. That's Peterborough, New Hampshire. And I live at Massasecum. That's our closest place name. A mile up the road from me is the lake, and I am in Warner, New Hampshire. And I am a basket maker. I'm also a member of the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe, and I'm happy to be invited here tonight and talk about whatever Vera wants to ask me.
I'll go next. Kwai and Deloise Brian Chenevert. I am also, like Sherry, a citizen of the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. I'm also a member of the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association, along with everybody else on the panel, actually. That's why we're all here. Just want to say thank you very much for having us all here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Kwekwe, Ndalawazi, Nanabe Wakwis, Elnu, Abenaki, Plawino. Hello, my name is Bass Fox in my native language. My name is James Taylor. I'm an Elnu tribal member. I'm also the tribal councilman for Elnu, and I'm Turtle Clan. I'm also an artist, doing mostly quill work, dabbling in a lot of other things. Also part of the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association. And I'm really looking forward to see where this goes tonight, and hoping this, gives us all better insight.
Very quickly, I'm going to give you an introduction to who we are. We're the indigenous people of Vermont, New Hampshire, parts of Massachusetts, New York, parts of Maine, and Quebec. And I have a couple pieces of artwork here to give a little bit of background about us. Today we hear a lot about boundaries and state lines and things of that nature. So if we take a look at the image here on the left, it's an aerial view of Undakana, which is our word for homeland. It was a watercolor painting by Amy Hook Theron. And you'll notice the land and the waterways, but not the little dividing lines that separate us. At one time, and continuing into this day, we were members of the Wabanaki Confederacy. We continued to be, and we were also members of the Seven Nations. So we had diplomatic alliances with people to the north, the south, the east, and the west of us, and we continued to have that. However, historically, about a year before Vermont became a state, we became an unrecognized tribe. And for hundreds of years, we remained that way. And then in 2011 and 12, 4 Abenaki tribes were recognized. If we look at the map on the right, we'll see that there are, in the green section, there are 4 tribes, Missisquoi, Nulhegan, Kawasuk, and Elnu, that are recognized tribes in Vermont. But it's really important to note that our people lived across our expansive territory on both sides of Vermont and New Hampshire and down toward Massachusetts. And across the border into Quebec, you'll see the 2 pink boxes marked Odanak and Wolanak, and those are 2 Abenaki communities up in Canada. There are other Abenaki communities that have not yet been recognized. So when we look at the title of tonight's talk about democracy and representation, we need to keep those things in mind because not everybody has a voice. So tonight, I'm hoping to give a voice to our Native community here in our homeland. So I'm going to pose this question to each of you. If you prefer, you can go one after the other, or you can just speak up, whoever wants to take on the question first. As an Indigenous person, how would you define democracy, and how do you see it reflected or not reflected in our culture, or in the larger Vermont community, New England, or in the United States communities?
So I'll go first. So for me, the true definition of democracy is everyone has an equal voice. Regardless of how big or how small your community is, regardless of your personal background, race, sexual orientation, any of that, a voice is a voice. It doesn't matter. There's no differentiating, and everyone's voice counts. I don't know if that's necessarily what we have today. The democracy that we have today isn't, without trying to split hairs, what the U.S. is really is a republic. It's not necessarily a true democracy. As we can see from all voices not counting. Even when you talk about voting, we get all these delegates and it doesn't really, your vote doesn't necessarily count if your state votes different than how you voted. So, for me personally, what true democracy means is everybody's voice counts, like I said. Not really sure how else to, at the moment, to kind of wrap my thoughts around what I'm trying to say other than that.
I think, Brian, you really hit the nail on the head. And I think in the bigger picture, from an Indigenous standpoint, I look at it like Native voices are always going to be at the back of the bus. It just seems that way. It doesn't matter where we are. You could be standing shoulder to shoulder with people, and we're always considered last. And that, for me, is a big problem. And in the current situation that we're in, I feel that even if things were to dramatically change, we'd still be encountering not having our voices truly heard. That's disappointing to me, because I've always believed in, whether I can, you agree with me or I agree with you, or where you are on the political spectrum, I can still respect you as a human being for your convictions. And I think today, it is, to me, that's democracy. Being able to hear someone out without yelling or screaming at them. And I just think that in the current situation, that's gone away. And the people that truly want to be listened to just aren't. That's how I feel about democracy.
I guess when you asked the question, Vera, I wondered if you meant our broader community or our Native community. And so I want to answer within our Native community. And for me, I feel like we do have democracy, the way Brian described it, within our tribe, that everybody's voice is heard. And for the longest time, I was nothing in the tribe. I was enrolled. That was it. I held no office. I had no title. And yet, when I spoke, I feel like people did listen when I would speak. And I couldn't even, because of my distance and that we own a farm, I couldn't even get to meetings necessarily. So it was like listening to me virtually that I had an equal voice. Now I'm the tribal genealogist, and Brian's honored me and asked me to join the historic department, and we're having a great time doing some fun historical things. But I feel like I do have a voice, and I've always felt in the Native community like we have an equal voice. Our talking circles, our respect for one another, listening, like Jim, what you said, we can disagree profoundly about things, but we show deep respect and we listen, and each person has a voice. And almost every situation I've been in, we've come out of it in a consensus by listening and letting each other's words shape each other's words. I do think we had a lot of influence on the formation of this country. Our governments, as Native governments, helped shape the U.S. government as it was being formed. And I agree that today we're seeing some pretty sad things. In New Hampshire, we're a pretty political state. First in the nation, right? And I think for most of us here, we kind of take that for granted. It's just, you're not really political or not political. It's a fact of life. From the time you're really, really little, you're used to seeing a lot of candidates for president at your door or jogging by your house during when they're campaigning. You see a lot of it. Today they're more in buses than jogging. And I live on a farm, and I tend to stay very busy in other things, so I stay out of a lot of the fighting that's going on currently. But I'm just seeing an incredible opening here in our state anyway for Native voices to be heard. And maybe it's the project we're working on. I don't know. I think it has a lot to do with what you started with, Vera, with what's happening culturally in our country, and that people are pretty in New Hampshire, people are pretty hungry to see what has been the culture that they've been ignoring all this time. And in New Hampshire, there's three. The state has always been English, French, and Indian. That's what New Hampshire's roots are all about. And yet the French felt forced to blend and be New Englanders, not French people, and forget their culture or think it didn't matter or it wasn't different. And our voices were silenced for the longest time. We didn't exist. And that's changing. And they're very hungry to hear our voice. So I think that feels a lot more like our native culture, that our voices matter. And I know you guys are having some good experiences in Vermont as well with some exciting projects you're doing. Because we all live in Endocannor, and there is no Vermont in New Hampshire. We have a highway that's a river between us.
That's it. A river runs through it.
That's right. Bill's favorite movie.
Feed Lola, would you? She hasn't touched it.
Vera, you're on mute. There you go.
Either of you gentlemen want to add anything on about the democratic process within your tribes?
I don't know. I think Sherry hit it on the head in terms of at our meetings and stuff. Everyone has a voice. Everyone gets listened to. It can make some of the meetings very, very long. But I think she hit it, perfectly. That we do all get a voice, and then there's it's not majority rules, it's a consensus. It's a consensus rule. So can we come together as a consensus to make the decision, not, well, these 5 said yes, these 3 said no, so the 5 win. So I think that's the major difference. And then there's something in my head when JT was talking, when he mentioned that we're always on the back of the bus, which is true. And the reason being that came in my mind is that as Indigenous people, we're the minorities of the minorities. We make up, about 2% of the entire population. So, overall, we even, when people think of minorities, we even get swept under the rug there. So I think from an overall standpoint, it's kind of tough to get our voice out there.
Exactly. In regards to, El New and, everybody has a voice. We have, 2 people, one person who basically represents the women, and myself that kind of represents the men. And, our roles within the community are to, and we're a small tribe. I think we're one of the smallest in Vermont. And so it's easy for us to, all communicate, within the group. But we have, you have, women who have issues, and then they have men that have issues. And so the way it works is that, those people, whatever it be, the issue that you have, whether it's male or female, at least you have each group has their representation. And then as in my role and, our other elder, Rose, her and I, could sit and we could discuss the issues together and try to come up with a consensus, so to speak, and how we solve those issues. And then if we, most of the time we kind of work it all out, with the parties involved. Right now, what's happened is, our elder Rose is, taking a turn for the worse. So she's no longer fulfilling her role. And so now that's a big gap that we need to fill. And so that's something that we are going to be faced with, dealing with soon. A lot of it's kind of fallen on me, and, having to kind of delegate this and come up with a solution. Big shoes to fill. So, I would say, we do have, a democracy in the way of allowing everybody an equal voice. Sometimes people don't think they may have an equal voice. Everybody does. And so, you're always going to have some people that feel like their voice matters more than others, but we have to consider the whole. And at the end of the day, it all seems to work out.
So what I'm hearing is that everyone feels pretty represented within their own Abenaki communities. From what I see, I think even within the larger Abenaki community, we have that consists of multiple tribes. I think there's a lot of representation also. But there was a common thread of Native voices not being heard or being suppressed. So I'd like to follow up on that idea to find out either how or why you think that's going on, or maybe give examples of how that's happening.
You mean Native voices not being heard in the larger culture?
Yes.
Well, I can give an example, and it's a little ironic, but whenever you would hear politicians speak about, and they'd throw in the token minority list, you didn't ever heard Indian on the list until Bernie. I think Bernie's the first one that's really, Obama maybe did a little bit of head nodding, but Bernie's really always include Native Americans and spoken that way. But that's pretty recent. So, and I don't even think in 2016 he was doing that, but in this go round, I think that, just a lot of time, I've done a lot of work with cultural competency training in New Hampshire. And so I've worked with a lot of minority groups, and boy, I've had some black ladies like in my face, really angry that I would dare think that Native Americans had anywhere near, but like they want to compare, was our bad shot as bad as their bad shot? And they don't see Native Americans as having anywhere near the bad shot that they had. So I think there's a lot of lack of understanding. I think that, was it you, Brian, that we're talking about the low numbers and the low percentages? I think that really, it helps us to be silent, but also most of our people just aren't pushing in your face people. And no matter, different reasons for different tribes. Here it was eugenics by and large recently, but we've had reason to be quiet, reason to not wanting to be seen and really out there. And when I look in the history books in New Hampshire and also Massachusetts, Vermont, I spend more time in the New Hampshire history books doing the genealogy. A common story I see is that the Native people were here. People weren't talking about them as, oh, they're Indian. It was, they were characters, and they were trappers and hunting guides and basket makers. Yeah, it was by the occupations you knew who they were and what they were doing, but it was as if their English neighbors were protecting them. And so you learn to be invisible in plain sight, but I'm beginning to see it was a lot more visible in plain like you just didn't want to be called out on it. So that lends itself to feeling silenced too, I think.
Yep, and I would agree. I don't know if I necessarily think it's that we're not heard as much as sometimes being ignored. I think sometimes from the greater view, politicians ignore us again because it's the numbers. They are politicians by nature. They're going to cater to the largest constituents, their voting base. And when I'm looking at numbers, if I have a 90%, 98% to be exact, voting base that I can cater to and take care of their needs, it doesn't really matter what that last 2% thinks or wants until it's brought up by the greater community and they support us and help us bring it to the forefront, which is started to happen more often. Even to Sherry's point with Bernie, he ignored us for the longest time, and he was nowhere to be found during the recognition process. I don't know, and I could be wrong, I might be misquoting, but I don't think I've ever even heard him say Abenaki in the public environment before until, and I don't know if I've ever heard him say it, but he's given us more attention more recently, and he's brought up, again, like Sherry said, head nods to the more general, greater Native American population, and of course he's allowed us to have some displays in his office, but prior to that, we were ignored by him as well. So I think it's just a matter of we're only important when we can be seen or needed, which is, an unfortunate thing. But from a political standpoint, like I said, I get the numbers game. I get they're in it to win, and they're going to win by catering or pandering to the numbers that they want, as we see in the greater political environment now with all the pandering going on and the division and divisiveness. It's all about who I can get more people to follow me. And then once I'm in, maybe then I'll start thinking about these other people. So like I said, I don't know if it's necessarily that we're not heard. I think sometimes we are heard, we're just ignored, or put on the back burner. Maybe, less insulting. We're not ignored, we're just put on the back burner until they can get around to us. Or until, like I said, the overall greater community starts to speak up and say, hey, there's all this injustice going on. We need to help everybody. As you saw with the perfect example is the Christopher Columbus statues. With the George Floyd thing, social justice started to spread. And then people were like, hey, this guy was not a good dude to, the indigenous people of this land. So people started to listen. We've been saying that for 40, 50, 60 years and nobody cared. But now that the greater community has said, hey, you know what, maybe we should look at this too, it's being listened to. So I think, unfortunately, it's a numbers game.
Absolutely. Both of you, speak truth. And with regards to, where we are, for me, the issue with Bernie has always been the fact that he wasn't around during the recognition. The only person that showed up or did anything for us, and I can't speak to Nulhegan or the Kawasaks, but I distinctly remember at the Quadricentennial Festival in Burlington, meeting Patrick Leahy for the first time, kind of marveling at how tall he is, and but just how genuine he was as a human being, and the words that he said. We had put invites out, but we didn't expect anyone to really show up in that of his caliber, let's say. And he came, and what was really interesting, it struck me, was he wasn't the typical politician where he kind of charged in, saw what we were doing, and introduced himself or like interjected himself into the situation for photo ops or, that sort of thing. He stood on the fringe, on the edge, and we noticed him and we approached him, which I as a Native person found that rather profound, and that it was a deference of respect towards us, that he did not want to interfere with what was happening in any way, and didn't want to take away from what we were doing. So I introduced myself, and a number of us did, and even after we were recognized, he sent an amazing letter that hangs in my office at work. Just complimenting, and congratulating us a year after our recognition. And when I read it, I realized it wasn't just somebody in his staff that wrote those words. Those were his words. And so as far as Bernie's concerned, and this is me, I find that he panders to people. And in case in point, he didn't recognize us in any way. And like to Brian's point, I have never heard him say anything in regards to the Native people from my home state, the Abenaki people. I've never heard it. I could be wrong, but I've never heard it. But what bothered me was he went out to Standing Rock, stood there in front of all of the nations that were gathered there, and there were Abenaki people in that crowd, and stood there and espoused that he was going to help the indigenous people. And it wasn't until people started posting from Vermont on their Facebook pages that Bernie couldn't even recognize the Native people in his state. Do you think he's really going to help you? Some people opened their eyes and were like, oh, I just thought no. And so I look at him as a politician. I look at Patrick Leahy as a human being. So the issue with our voices, like Brian said, being put on the back burner is where we're getting put. And to Sherry's experience, it becomes where you're part of what they call the victim scale. Like, where are you on the victim scale? And we will always, I feel, we will always be at the bottom of the victim scale. There's always going to be somebody that has it, worse than we have it. Mm-hmm. And yet, we're the people of the land that they're on. And I fully understand and accept their truth and their pain with their ancestors being brought here, enslaved. But it's hard to accept when someone turns around and tries to say, well, we had it worse than you. It's really hard to swallow. Yeah. And I think that goes to, and we'll probably discuss this, later, and for me, is the whole reparations subject. And Sherry probably, sorry guys, but I think Sherry is, I look at her as an elder, so I'm sure she remembers things that I don't remember from my age, but this has come up once, a number of times throughout the recent past. So I just think we need a louder voice when the time comes. And I see just in the business that I'm in, I work as a graphic designer for a company that designs law enforcement badges, fire department, security, throughout not just the country, but throughout the world. And in this country alone, since the George Floyd incident, I've noticed a huge uptick in communities who have what are now deemed racist or objectionable items or seals from their states or their cities or their towns. And now they're scrambling to remove those items and come up with new things to replace them with. And Fairfax, Virginia comes to mind. They had a Confederate soldier on one side standing next to a British soldier on Lord Fairfax's family crest that's on their police badge. So they decided they wanted to replace it. And what do they want to replace it with? They want to replace it with Queen Elizabeth with a kneeling Indian in front of her, holding a fistful of tobacco. I actually told the salesperson, I cannot believe in my mind that these people really want to replace a Confederate soldier and a British soldier with a kneeling Indian. I mean, it's just we're still waiting to hear if they're going to accept that. So, but even in the state of Massachusetts, for years they've talked about changing the state seal. And for years we've always said, even at work, and I've had numerous discussions with Massachusetts Indigenous people, that I said, it's going to be something huge that's going to make them want to do this. But it isn't going to happen anytime soon. And that was years ago. And here we are, where they're literally on the cusp of actually addressing it. And, which would be a very, very good change. And because I understand the Confederate soldier and the British soldier, but that to me, I don't know, it's a stretch. But as far as the Massachusetts seal, when you read the Latin description, there is no way around it for me as an Indigenous person, that sword above that Indian's head is there for a reason. And that reason was that if they didn't go along, then that sword was going to be the one that takes care of it. And the Massachusetts Mass Bay people certainly tried very hard to take care of their Indian population, albeit through war, disease, and ultimately selling what was left to, into slavery, into the islands. So, but they're still here, and they are a testament to their own people.
I hear common threads coming up between all three of you. Sherry had brought up eugenics, which I'm sure many people have never heard about. It was a movement in the earlier part of the 20th century that was designed, at least in Vermont, the Vermont Eugenics Survey, to lower the numbers of Indigenous people that were considered to be undesirable. And as Jim was just saying, he was talking about representation of Indigenous people in logos and signs. We certainly hear representation of ourselves from other people outside of our communities as well. So I would really like to hear a little bit more about how other people are trying, let's start by talking about how other people are trying to represent us for us, and what kind of issues our communities are facing with that.
Are you speaking to like allies or people that we feel are speaking on our behalf but not acting on our behalf and with our permission?
I think there's a little bit of, I hear a little bit of all of that, in that there are allies that think they're being good allies and they're speaking for us, like people who want to decolonize for us versus helping us to decolonize, or people that are saying this is a BIPOC organization, maybe, but no BIPOC people, or not equal representation of BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, people of color, or people that are our allies. Whatever you'd like to talk about.
I can give a little example. I just recently had a conversation with a woman who I know was very sincere, very excited about wanting to, just excited about an opportunity that, wow, you guys are here. And this is a woman who's known me for decades and decades. And I've never hidden who I was, but just invisible in plain sight. And at any rate, she had gotten her master's degree in Indian Studies from Dartmouth many, many, many years ago, and acknowledged that she had chosen to study Western tribes because she had learned in school that in New Hampshire, the Indians, in Vermont, in New England, the Indians were all gone. So then as we were talking, I forget what came up, but she said, well, yes, and I know. And she said, and the French and the English soldiers just, they just use you guys back and forth as dupes. And you just sit there like, actually I said, there's a very good example of how we're going to do some myth busting, because absolutely not. We were playing whichever side was going to, we've understood, our warriors and our elders all understood what each side meant to us at any one given time, and we made intelligent choices. And, do you understand that the Abenaki spoke like 5 languages minimum fluently? They spoke French, they spoke English, they spoke Abenaki, they spoke other neighboring languages, and they understood Latin completely because they were, and she's just like, oh, wow. And so, I think it's really hard for allies to know. And she was very gracious to be able to hear. She said, we just assume that we know because that's what we learned. And so it's nice when you meet an ally that's willing to listen and open their eyes and ears, because not all are. And I just want to say very quickly, in defense of my former experience, that I want you all to know that all that lady's Black sisters sat her down, didn't let her stay in my face, and calmed her down. And I think it's so important that whatever our experience is, it's our experience. And for each of us, as you were saying, Jim, they're different experiences. They're not the same at all. But I never feel like the whole, I guess this was part of my education, is this whole business of who has it worse and who has it better is sort of a way to keep all of us in check. Because if there's somebody worse than you, then you better be careful, or you might be like them. Like, I just don't go there. To me, it's just, what is our reality? And people have blamed me for being a little Pollyanna-ish and seeing the world through happy glasses. But I think another piece of this is, and as I was listening, especially to you, Jim, but also to Brian, I know the town we grew up in, I mean, for our family, and Ryan had asked me earlier about had I ever lived in Vermont. My great-great-grandfather and mother lived in Vermont, and we were our family became part of the gypsy families that traveled around New England and made baskets. And my great-grandfather settled first in Ashburnham, Mass., but then in Peterborough, New Hampshire. And, I lost my train of thought there. Talking about women and men. So we grew up in Hillsborough. It was a mill town. There were a lot of different nationalities. We knew we were Indian. We never hid that. Everybody knew that. I did not experience any racism at all growing up as a kid in Hillsborough. None. My brother got made fun of all the time. And as an adult, I've come to realize that, especially studying the basket making, that Indian women are not threatening, we're not threatening to white society, but warriors, very threatening to white society. And so I think our gender made a big difference in how we experience treatment, at least locally, for my family. And I suspect for a lot of families as well. So I don't know if I'm always just a Pollyanna-ish or if I'm a woman from a native culture who experienced things differently, you know?
So I think for me, I don't think I've, at least not me personally, have seen anyone intentionally try to speak for us. Most of the things I've seen, it's usually with some good intent. I think there just usually is, maybe it's out of enthusiasm or whatever, they just fail to reach out and ask us what we want. Or is this what you want, instead of thinking that's what we want and then going to do it and then coming back later and saying, hey, look what I did. Aren't you so happy? Aren't you grateful? Well, no, not really, because that's not what we wanted. And I think with your BIPOC topic too, I think it kind of goes in the same thread. You know, it was a lot of times with these committees, they're like, okay, let's form these committees. Well, how about Black and Indigenous people of color? That'd be great. All right, let's form it. Then you get there and you're like, well, we have to have at least one. We need a token Indian on this committee. And of course, it's a committee of 12 and you got one Indigenous voice. It doesn't usually work too well, or you get washed out. I don't think it's with intent, but it's just oftentimes how it happens. And, I see it a lot too with people trying to, being the tribal historian, I get a lot of people emailing me and reaching out to me because they're writing a book or they're making a movie and they want me to read it. And how's this sound? And I'm like, well, you've already got your mind made up. You just want me to correct any minor errors. But when I want to correct the whole thing because you're completely geographically and historically wrong, you get mad. So if you want to work on something like that, reach out to us and we'll be happy to work with you from the ground up and make it right from the beginning. It's not oftentimes taken well. I usually try to say it as politely as I can to soften the blow. It has worked out once. We have one guy who wants to make a movie about the Turner's Falls massacre, and he's willing to work with us once he gets the funding. I think I reached out to Rich, gave him a heads up on it too. It's down the line, it's kind of a pipe dream the guy has, but he's reached out to us already and said, hey, I want you guys in this from the ground up, from a historical standpoint, from a material culture standpoint, to make sure everything's accurate. Mm-hmm. I was honestly floored, that usually I get the, hey, I wrote this book about, Passaconaway and, how he rode away on a toboggan off the mountain into the heavens. And like, okay, we got to start over here. And they don't want to hear it. So again, most of what I've seen is not with ill intent. It's just they have their idea of how they're going to help. And they never stop to consider, it's not about me. If I'm trying to do it for them, it should be about them. So that's just, what I've seen.
Ryan, you bring up a good point. With regards to people you think are well-intentioned, or they believe they're well-intentioned, and they're speaking on our behalf. Case in point for me is the mural in Burlington, which has been very contentious, and people have called it racist. And this gentleman decided that he would spray paint this piece of art, and and wrote the words racism or racist on the painting. And then when he was subsequently arrested for it, he then said he was doing it on behalf of the Abenaki people. Well, that put not just my chief, but Sherry and Brian's chief, Don Stevens, somewhat in a hot seat because of where he is location-wise in the Northeast Kingdom, to basically come out and say, whoa, time out. We do not have an issue with this mural, and we in no way support someone vandalizing it on our behalf. Me as an artist and a very avid powwow dancer, representing my people, and been doing for a number of years. If you know anything about powwow, you know that you come in contact with a lot of various dance styles or categories and peoples. And I saw the mural, and there was Champlain, there was this Indian. My issue with it was, all right, they got this native person, and he's a grass dancer, and he's dancing powwow in front of Samuel Champlain. Now, I don't know if that person that was painted was of Abenaki descent, but at least there was a native person represented, albeit not what I would deem as someone who's also a living historian would think, okay, that doesn't really represent the Abenaki people in that way. But if that person was Abenaki by descent, then he is being represented, or we're being represented through him. But other people came out and said, well, it was racist because he was kneeling in front of Samuel Champlain. Well, if anybody knows anything with regards to people who are grass dancers, it's a dance style. And that this is something that you will see if you go to a powwow and there are grass dancers there. You will see how they dance, and they dance where they almost look like they're on their knees. So, that being said, here you have an ally who ends up putting us in a negative light with the community. And, I fielded calls, my chief fielded calls with regards to like, hey, did you see what happened? Do you guys support this? Like, how can you, and we were like, we in no way support what this person did. And we didn't really, it wasn't something we wanted to get involved in. We knew it was an issue with, some people in the Burlington community and, greater Vermont, but it wasn't something that was on our radar, for change. To the other end of it, I mean, we have allies like the Retreat Farm in Brattleboro, who as of late is actively seeking our voices as Abenaki people living within that community in the Brattleboro area, to see that things are not that we're being acknowledged, and the land and places and the waterways are being acknowledged in the right way, with returning representing them through Abenaki names, so that people that come to visit Vermont, tourists, can see, wow, this is what it was called, and it's still called that because we're still here. It never went away. It's just that people came in and washed over the land and basically washed away the actual place names, and now we're reclaiming that, and we're getting that with help from the Retreat Farm. For the life of me, I can't remember Buzz's last name. It escapes me, but he's been a really strong voice within the community. And Rich Holshoe has also been, spearheading this with our help in that area. So they are what I think true allies who really want to make a change and do it in a respectful way, with not assuming, okay, we're going to do this on your behalf. They actually ask us, how do you want us to do it for you? And so that's a big positive for me and my community. The other downside for me is when we, as Brian was saying, is people say, oh, look what we did for you. Don't you feel good about it? And for me, they're looking for validation so that they can then say, well, see, we included them and it makes them feel better. And that is one of the issues I have with people who have like large tracts of land, and they contact me in an email and say, hey, we own 300 acres of land in Dummerston, and we'd like to invite you and some of your community to come out and see what we're doing, and tell us about like what it was like to live here, and how your people farmed, and so we want to be respectful of you, and we might give you a little piece of area where you can plant some plants. And for me, it might be well-intentioned in some ways, but it comes across as, we feel really guilty that we have your land, so we want you to come out and make us feel better about it. And I just have an issue with that. And and I try to, in a very nice way, respond back that, some of the things that they tell us they're doing on the land is inappropriate, albeit, holding native ceremonies that aren't being, that are being sold, and not being performed by Native people. Because if they were performed by Native people, they wouldn't be selling them. So some of those are the issues that we have. And, it might come across as like, being off-putting to them, that we're kind of brushing them off. But it's just, I don't want to, insulting is too strong of a word. It's just, I think they're somewhat well-intentioned, but they're just, I guess, ignorance is the only thing that comes to mind. But
yeah, it comes across condescending.
Condescending, that is the word I was looking for. Yes, it kind of condescending. And so, and then sometimes I've actually had to call people out on that. One of my jobs as tribal councilman is having to address some of these places that are doing this. They're holding sweats, they're holding spirit name, come find your totem, take a sweat, and it's $5,300 for the weekend, and they're making all this money, and then when they have to call them up and say, all right, so what is the native, is the person that's performing the sweats, are they indigenous? No, they went out and studied in some Guatemalan village, and they read a book from this shaman and that shaman. And but if you guys want to come and see what we're doing, that'd be fine with us. And so they're looking for validation, and I just have to tell them, we're not comfortable with what you're doing, and we'd like you to stop. And I know I'm not the only tribal councilman that's dealing with this. I have a number of other contacts, even in here in New England, and Mashpee, Pequots, they all are experiencing it. and they say it's just a thing, so, but that's kind of where I'm at with, you got really good voices, well-intentioned, but, and others that just come across as, rather condescending.
Yeah, and I love your example of the retreat farm. Like, it's a perfect example of how it should work.
Exactly.
Reaching out, but you also made me think of another perfectly bad example when you talked about Champlain. I wish I could remember the name of the town in New York, but I can remember. I don't know if you guys remember, a couple months ago, they made a big deal out of the Champlain statue there, and same thing. There was a Indian in a Plains headdress kneeling below him, and some well-intentioned person, thought it was offensive and raised the funds and talked to the town and did all this other stuff to get some signage added, but they never once reached out to any of the communities that surround Lake Champlain. They didn't reach out to the Abenaki, they didn't reach out to the Mohawk, they didn't reach out to the Mohican. I'm sorry. So they created these signages, and I just remember from looking at the pictures, one of the plaques they had was this whole story about Sacagawea, and I just couldn't help but laugh and shake my head and think, like, this is the best you can do? Like, you couldn't ask anybody? And then we run into the problem that now if we come back and try to correct that, I'm sure you guys have run into this in the past too, is that then you get the attitude, well, why do we bother? Nothing's ever good enough for these people. We already did this. We went out of our way to put these plaques up, and now they're saying that's wrong.
Yeah.
So, it puts us in another bad spot. And like, it's just a perfect example of, again, trying to speak for us instead of speaking with us.
It goes right to, years ago. It's like, I don't know if you experience it as well, but you have people that say, so is it okay if I call you a Native American or American Indian? Like, what do you want to be called? And it's funny because nobody came to us and asked us what we wanted to be called. So, someone came up with, well, they're American Indians today, but tomorrow they might be called Native Americans. And so it's like, if they just said, hey, we got this idea and this is what we want to do, and what would you like to be called? Well, I think we'd like to be called Indigenous, or basically just call us for who we are. I'm Alnobaki, my people are the Elnu, and let's just start right there. But everybody has to put a label on something, and and somebody else is, like Brian says, well, this is what we came up with. If you're not happy with it, what the heck?
Yep.
But that is a good example, though.
So I think we're all agreeing on this idea with representation. The best way a person can be a good ally is to come to us and consult with us, make sure we're all on the same page, and perhaps more meaningfully, bring us to the table in a meaningful way where we're not outnumbered and where we have a real say in a project.
Absolutely.
Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So we're running out of time. Before we take questions, just one final question. Are there any projects, which JT has already alluded to the retreat farm, but are there any other projects that people should know, or other ways people should know about how we're representing ourselves, or anything like that?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple going on. I'll speak to one that I want to say I've been working on a book, but it wasn't actually a book. It's just that I'm a big history nerd. So I've been keeping this data for literally decades. And then finally someone said, you know what, you should put all this information into a book. So just as the years go on, anytime I found any event going through town histories and all these academic things, I would put a note, date, what happened. So someone had asked me, like I said, to put it into a book form. So I thought about it, but I kept putting it off because I haven't had time to reframe it. You know, I don't want, this data is already out there, but everything in it is from the, for lack of a better word, colonial viewpoint. All these historical documents were written by colonials. So it's from their viewpoint. So I wanted to make the book from our viewpoint and just haven't had a chance to do that yet. And thankfully, Sherry, being the great elder she is, said, listen, Ding Dong, why don't you ask for help? So Sherry's been gracious enough to start editing it for me and helping me get these in. So, you know, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have that done and we'll have a book about all the historical events that have happened in New England regarding us from our mouths. You know, and I think that'll be a first that I know of doing that. And the second kind of ties into that, and I'll let Sherry speak more to that, is that because of that, you know, we found a lot of these sites where all these events happen, good, bad, ugly. A lot of times they're ignored, or again, if you'll see road signs that have strictly the colonial view. Well, a bunch of Indians came and they killed people, and that's it. You know, that's what we see. So Sherry and another friend of ours, Daryl, came up with the idea to create this, what will be hopefully, you know, what we're calling Abenaki Trails. And I'll just leave it at that, and I'll let Sherry take it from there because it's really her project. I'm just along for the ride.
Well, thank you, Brian. We're very glad to have you along for the ride as the tribal historian. And it's really Daryl's project. It was his idea for a very long time. Daryl is a manager for the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. And so I think the whole idea, and in New Hampshire, they're responsible for the state historical markers. So he's worked in several different districts. So he's seen a lot of those signs about massacres and whatever else that you might see on the side of the road for signs. And just always had this idea, like, let's just do something to make this, to kind of talk about our history. And then when we worked to get the Commission on Native Affairs established, you know, we had a lot of people say we were just a pass-through state. And I know that this piece of Endocana is not the only place that happened, because when I was searching for my ancestors on the west side of the river, I got the exact same kind of comments. Oh, we never had any Indians live here. No. So Daryl really wanted a way for people to be very, very clear about that we have always lived here. And then we were really lucky to get some supporters, and I think Brian can attest that the supporters we have worked with a lot of Abenaki people from both sides of the river over the years, and they are very respectful, and they don't make decisions for us, and they ask us what we want. And so it's just been a really, really fun and powerful project to, we're doing it in our own hometowns, and so we go to the selectmen and we tell them we're doing the project more out of just a, hey, heads up, this is what we're doing. We didn't want you to hear about it through the grapevine in a potentially strife-ridden political climate. We're not going to go graffiti signs we don't like or any such thing as that. Here's what we want to do. And then we work with the historical societies and whoever else wants to work with us. And it's been fun. We go through the history books and we pull information out. But then as a genealogist, I already know the families that were Native. And so we can show kind of the continuous. One, I have to say my most fun thing finding Lynn Clark pulled out they have a folder of newspaper clippings from the Kearsarge Independent, and one of them was about the Gypsies came to town and how many horse teams there were, and they were selling their baskets, and they started in New York and came all the way through Vermont, and now they're in Warner, and they're staying below so-and-so's house for the night, and then they're going to go down south and sell their baskets in the cities. And it was just like, it was like maybe 2 family bands that it could possibly be, mine or one other. So that's pretty cool to find that. But anyway, I got all excited talking about the project. And what were we starting? What was your question, Vera?
That's a perfect place to sort of tie this all together. I've really enjoyed talking to all of you about democracy, representation of ourselves. I'd like to add one other project on here. So for years, we've been contacted by teachers wanting, they try to bring Abenaki culture bears into their classrooms. Sometimes it's not possible. And especially in the current climate, teachers are looking for resources and curriculum materials and stuff like that. And this is prior to COVID. A group of educators started working on an education website. And if any teachers are looking for resources that have been vetted by our community, that have been through a group of educators and also historic preservation officers from tribes, you can visit the Abenaki Arts and Education Center. The website address is Abenaki, ABENAKI-edu.org. And it's an exciting new resource where teachers can literally find movies where one of us or many other people might be talking about our culture. There are book references. Brian wrote an article about the Hannah Duskin Monument in history. That's up there. So there are a lot of vetted resources. And we'll be continuing to add more. There's a submit button so people can tell us what they think are good things, and we can start getting more in there. So thank you all. This has been really nice. I don't know if there are any questions for anyone.
Hi, this is Ryan. I have a question or two, if it's all right if I ask. I think some people might be familiar with the Iroquois Confederacy and its democratic principles, and some folks might know that had at least some influence on the people who are termed the founding fathers of the United States when they were looking to set up a democracy. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Abenaki or the Wabanaki Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy, and if there was some overlap or influence in terms of democratic principles between the two?
Who would like to take that?
I guess I can. The Wabanaki Confederacy is still active, albeit not at the scale that it once was. As far as it, it did include the Iroquois Confederacy, but it included what we call 7 nations. So there's still the Iroquois were. We have wampum belts that to this day that illustrate or basically they confirm that the Iroquois were. I'm trying to think of how to word this, but they were like they whipped. There's one belt where there's a figure that represents the Iroquois, and what they hold is basically the whip. And the whip doesn't mean that they're whipping us, but that they were going to be the ones that would make sure that if we fell away from the Confederacy, and now when I say the Confederacy, the Wabanaki Confederacy is any one of the Native communities that were part of it, that they were the ones to bring us back. So at some point, they've kind of fallen away from the Confederacy because they created their own the Iroquois Confederacy of the Six Nations. But we have the belts that prove that they were once part of it. The Wabanaki Confederacy is made up of the Western Abenaki, and to the east of the Western Abenaki, you have the Pennacook Abenaki, the Kawasuks, and then as you move further east, you'll come into you'll hit Maine. In Maine, you have the Penobscots. On the Maine New Brunswick border, you have the Passamaquoddies, and you have the Canadian Passamaquoddies and U.S. Passamaquoddies, but they're the same. They're the same people. They're just divided by a border that didn't exist, much like Vermont and New Hampshire. And then to the east of them, you have in St. John's or Fredericton, you have the Maliseets, or they refer to themselves as the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the beautiful river, and which is, by today's standards, is called the St. John's, but the river in their language was the Wolastoqiyik. And then you have some Mi'kmaq people that live in New Brunswick, and there's a couple of small communities there. And I know there's a couple of small communities of Mi'kmaq people in the up near Aroostook County in Maine, but just over the border. I know there's a few enclaves of Mi'kmaq people there. And then as you go out to Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, that's exclusively Mi'kmaq people. So they're all part of the Confederacy, and we still have, active Confederacy meetings once a year. We didn't have one last year. There was some issues, just couldn't get it organized, and it doesn't look like we're going to have one this year either, due to COVID. But the Confederacy is we all stay in touch as communities, and with whatever's going on in their communities, albeit gas pipelines, issues that they're having within their homelands. So we're always staying in touch as tribal leaders with those tribal leaders there. The Confederacy was revived, and I can't put my the exact year, but when we first got recognized in 2011, the year after our recognition, we were approached by a delegation of Maliseets and Passamaquoddies to host the first Confederacy meeting in the state of Vermont in, I think it was at least 300 years. So we hosted that. It was a 4-day meeting. It was really amazing for us as communities, because it was something we'd never done before. And it was also for us a huge validation to be considered and be brought back in to be with essentially our tribal families. We look at them as our cousins. And through the Confederacy, I've, also discovered, and it's been brought to us, is that when the first elders and people that lived out on the islands in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, when they started to see the masts of ships that were either they were whaling, fishing, whatever they were doing, the elders saw that and had a vision that very bad things were coming. So what they did is they asked people within the communities to take the sacred bundles and ceremonies and to travel as far west as they could to get away from this this perceived problem that was going to drastically affect their lives. And they were told to go as far west until they came to where the food grows on the water. And so they traveled, and by today's standards, they would have been considered astronauts, going to places they'd never been to. And along the way, they kind of peeled off and kind of, some fell away, and they fell away in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and then traveled all the way out to the Great Lakes, and where you find the sacred wild rice that grows on the water. So now they're known as the Anishinaabe people, which makes up the Ojibwe, the Chippewa. They're now bringing back those ceremonies and those stories, and so the Confederacy had awakened that. So for me, that's been an amazing circle. Just, here we are. 2012, we host the first Confederacy meeting in the history of Vermont in 300 years, and now here it is, 2020, and we're having, our ancestors coming back and teaching us. So it's kind of profound, for me. And but yeah, the Confederacy is, slightly different than the Iroquois Confederacy, but they had it. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was the one that really immersed himself in the Iroquois Confederacy and how it worked. And by the time the colonials came along, and it was, the, Rev War period, we were kind of, we were pushed around, we were pushed further up. And the Iroquois Confederacy, they were a force to be reckoned with. They pretty much had dominated most of the New England. They put a big thumping on Abenaki people, and here in Vermont, because the only thing that separated us from them was a lake. And so, they, throughout the surrounding area, Hurons, the Patuns, the tobacco people, they were all gobbled up by the Iroquois Confederacy and pushed. Even Hurons, for one, they divided in 3 different ways. And plus, the Abenaki, at that point, we were always siding with we sided with the French, and then when the French lost, we sided with the English against the Americans. So that's probably why we didn't have a big enough voice with regards to how it shaped, the current government system that we have.
Thank you so much for joining us. I want to let you go. I do have one last question, if that's okay. It's about cultural values and around the concept of consensus, which you mentioned in terms of your decision-making process. I know for people of European descent, sometimes consensus is what's aimed for, but it's often seen as being too inefficient, slow, difficult. And I'm just curious, what are the cultural values of the Abenaki that play into the desire to have consensus be the way that decisions are made in the democracy?
I think, for me, it's more because we're all family. So, in today's current environment, I can completely disagree with somebody over politics 1,000 miles away, and we can argue till the day is long, and nobody cares because we may not ever see them again, or they're family. We don't care about each other. Whereas within our community, we're all interrelated. I'm related to Sherry, I'm related to JT, I'm related to Vera. We're all connected, even though we're part of different bands. We all have similar relations going back. So, like I believe it was Sherry who said earlier, we may disagree, but we're not going to get heated over it. And even if we do, at the end of the day, we're going to work it out. And that's kind of what consensus is. We're all going to sit here and talk about this. I might not win, so to speak, what my viewpoint is, what I want. But at the end of the day, I can agree that, all right, I might not get what I want, but JT's version probably is a little better. Everybody else agrees. Give me some solid reasons why I would agree. And I might not like it, but I can still agree with it, that it's the best thing for everyone as a whole. It doesn't have to always be about me. And I think that's the difference in a lot of the cultural differences. It's the difference between we and me. In our community, we try to do what's best for us. It's the we. In the dominant society right now, particularly in the hotbed political world we're in, it's about me and mine and what I can get for us, not for everybody. So to me, that's where the definition of consensus comes in. It's the family-based agreement versus who's right or wrong.
And I would add that I agree, Brian, 100%. And I would add that for Abenaki people, I think always it was small family bands. And so that really helps with the consensus process. If you're in a huge society the way we are, although even in New England, in our town halls and our small towns, we can do closer, probably than other parts of the country. But for Abenaki people, definitely, it's that and respect. I really think that that's just key, that we have that respect and that you just wouldn't be disrespectful to, which isn't to say that every Abenaki behaves that way, but that's just what I was always taught. I think it's what I see in the rest of our tribe and the way we act, and so many other groups that I've been involved with, or tribes, bands, I've seen the same behaviors. So I think that really hits it.
I think the to both Brian and Sherry's points too, we still hold our communities, are held together by the women. They have a strong voice, and that's been, that goes way back. And, the men look to the women, and the women will, consult amongst themselves and then come back. And doesn't mean the men are going to listen, but at least they've been put on notice that, this is what the women feel the community wants. And if the men disagree and it fails or it doesn't go the way that they want it to go, then it's entirely on them. So as Native people, we everyone has a voice. So there's the consensus in their voice and in their words. And we have to, so we have to come to an agreement. There's no walking away, disagreeing. It may not be the outcome that you want as a whole. I mean, as one person. And, to use the old, there's no I in team. And that's exactly how it is in the Native community there, in our communities, is that it isn't about me. It's never about just me. It's about everyone. And the other thing that we take into consideration and I'd say this as a whole, as most Indigenous people who truly are, like good Native Indigenous people, that we look to everything that we do here affects the next 7 generations behind us. So we take that seriously. And so what I do will directly affect, my future generations of my people. So that's always something that we keep in the back of our heads, is like, am I doing this in a good way? Am I being respectful to my community? I think that's another big consensus for most Native people is having that as part of your like DNA, that you're not thinking of yourself. There's no ego. And I've always said this. I've had this discussion with my brother a number of times. And my brother, he and I, we don't walk the same path. But he's slowly kind of coming around in the respect that I've told him, I said, your problem is that you have a three-letter problem, and it's called ego. You're letting your ego dictate everything that you do and how you listen to people and how you communicate. And I said, the problem is you need to start listening with native ears instead of ears that you think you've been given. And he's slowly starting to realize that, and so that's where I think, consensus is as Native people and as Abenaki people. I know that, we get along very well. El Nu gets along very well with the Cows, Nulhegan. I mean, we get along with everybody, and at least everybody tries to get along with everybody. We have some hiccups from time to time, but that's people have this. I want to say grandiose idea that all Native people see eye to eye, and that we all, we're all peaceful, and we're all, everything is, crayons and lollipops, and we're people, and we have differences of opinion, and there's lateral violence between tribes. It's still going on. So people think that if all of a sudden, before the, first, great canoes landed on our shores, that we were all just, it was one big love fest. Well, beg to differ. We had differences, and, people were fighting over land, fighting over territories. So, and that still goes on today. So, but as far as the people in this group right here, we're all family. We've had our differences, and but we all, we're all Abenaki.
I just wanted to add one other thing about consensus, which is something I don't think that really comes up, is in the United States, you need to be 18 years old to vote and have your voice heard and campaign and things of that nature. And of course, every tribe has their own rules surrounding this. But in El Nu, our kids come into our Grand Council. So 22 years ago, we had 22 years ago, we had a really important decision to make. And my 5-year-old daughter came and sat through hours and hours of council as the decision and thoughts went around the room, or we were actually in a wigwam at the time, about what we should do. And she sat there for hours, and every time it came back around the circle, when it came to her, if she had something to say, she was allowed to say it. So we're not just talking about adults. We're talking about representation at all different levels and consensus at many different levels.
Absolutely. And I think it just needs to be said. And I'm speaking on my behalf. I don't want to, I'm not including, I'm not speaking for others, but for El Nu and myself, as a tribal councilman, I was asked, what does reparations look like to you? And, and I thought about it, and I've had discussions with, people in the community and people, I'm very close with our chief, and, and he agrees that I understand reparations, you know, and I know where people are coming from in respect to reparations. I mean, the Japanese that were interred in the internment camps in California and Hawaii during the Second World War, they were granted reparations, and to the tune of, like, I think it was $25,000 per person that was in the internment camps. And I can't remember. I'm trying to think the Japanese actor that was in Star Trek, but he was one of those people whose he was a boy during that time, and he was in the internment camp, and he too, got his allotment. So then the discussion came up. I remember when I was younger and Bill Clinton was in office, there was discussion about reparations being given to the descendants of people who were brought here as slaves. They were trying to come up with a dollar amount. And I believe it was discussed that, well, if we come up with a dollar amount for people who were brought here as slaves or their descendants were, what do we give to the people that we took the land from? Like, what's the dollar amount for that? And I remember hearing that and trying to think, like one, that's an impossible dollar amount. So it went away. Bill Clinton was, influenced to let it, I don't want to say slip. It wasn't going to be something that his administration was going to continue, because they felt like they were going to hit that's brick wall. And I know that a lot of Native people were like, well, okay, if they get X amount of dollars, what are we getting? And so for me, reparations at this point in time, for us, reparations are land, land, and land. Tax-free land. That's what, like, some of the communities are looking at, that because we're from the land, and land is like invaluable to us. You can't put a dollar amount on land, and you shouldn't, because nobody should own the land. And that's the way it's been. And now everything's a dollar amount. Yeah, there are Native communities that will take the dollar amount, but they may already have the land. The tribes in Vermont, Nelhegan has a small piece of property up in their community. Elnu, we don't. Kawasucks, they don't. Missisquoi has a little bit as well. So I think for us, when I think of reparations, I just think of land.
Yeah, I would agree with that, JT. I think, it's a hard discussion, and people in power don't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because money's easier.
Yeah.
We can raise taxes, and we can, give you X amount, like what happened in Maine. We're going to just give you X amount of money and go away. It's basically, if we give you land and we don't tax you on it, it's yours. We can't get rid of you. You're here permanently. You're here forever. We can't ignore you. So I think that's the bigger issue with getting that reparations. Mm-hmm. I don't know very many people, if any at all, that would disagree with you. I think you're absolutely spot on with it. It's all about land. That's where we come from. That's where we are. So you can't disconnect the Abenaki people from the land. There's no Abenaki without it.
Yeah.
I was saying that here we get to see a lot of politicians. So in the primary season, I went to see Bill Weld down the street. And at the end, when it was the question and answer time, I asked him about, his policy or his thoughts on Native American what was his position on Native American issues? What did he have to say that I hadn't heard him even speak to Native Americans? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I really liked Native Americans. He goes, I was really big on, letting the casinos come in Massachusetts. And I'm just like, oh my God. And then he said, but one thing I'll tell you right now, he said, if anybody deserves I can't even say the word. What are we talking about? Say it for me, Jim.
Reparations.
Thank you. Reparations. If anybody deserves reparations, it's you, he said. And I was just like, okay, thank you. So, I mean, of course, I was talking about pipelines, tribal rights, sovereignty, like serious issues in Native American country, not casinos and reparations. I mean, it's a serious issue. It wasn't what I was speaking to. And then I had to, I don't know. Anyway, it seemed odd, but I guess it was a nice statement.
Something that occurs to me that should probably be said about our connection to the land and our connection to the ancestors. When you walk into a place, a specific location where your ancestors were, when you stand upon where their village was, or when you stand in that field where your ancestors are buried, that feeling of connection is so strong. And there are a lot of sites out there that need protecting.
Mm-hmm.
But when you stand at some of those sacred sites, like, by the Bellows Falls, when you're by the faces, the feeling that you get from the land is so strong. I don't have that kind of connection anyplace else I go.
I always say that when I come, I go up. It's like the minute I hit the border, Vermont, and I spend time there, it just recharges my native batteries. I mean, it's the only way I can describe it. I mean, I literally, I spent 2 days there last Thursday and Friday, and we went out onto the land in the national forest, and we actually went to a cave that dates. It's the oldest rock in the country, and there's a cave there, or an overhang. Not easy to get to. It was an amazing place, and I mean, we only spent maybe, I'd say, an hour or two there. But I know when we ended up climbing out of there, I mean, we all felt like, wow, this, like, we were like, right, we're standing right where our ancestors have, stood and slept, and this is so untouched by, like humans, and that came after us. And it was really powerful for me. And I know it was powerful to the other people that were with me, that were also there. But it is, I guess it's electric, you feel, it within you that your ancestors are there with you, So, very good way to put it, Vera.
Yeah.
That's something I really wanted to say in the beginning. When we played the calling in song, I like to start almost every program I do with the calling in song.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I can't go wrong, because when we're calling people in, we're also calling in our ancestors, and they're there with us, and they give us strength.